Too dark?
What's a population? Or sorry, yeah, we'll start with the population. What's a population?
A group of like individuals living in the same area.
What's a species?
Would it be like a group that's genetically the same as something?
Genetically closely related, and
The ability to repopulate.
they can reproduce and create viable offspring. Populations are usually subdivisions of a species. You can have different populations of a single species. What's a community?
A group of populations.
A group of populations living in usually a given area. And what's an ecosystem?
The living and non-living.
It's your community plus the environment. How many species do you think we have on our planet?
Thousands?
Keep going.
Billions?
Billions. How many billions? Well, maybe not billions. Millions? How many million?
90?
It's in the range. I believe your textbook suggests that there's between 14 and 100 million species on this planet. I remember when I was in biology in college, my textbook said that there was somewhere between 2 and 10 million, but that they expected that number was wrong because it probably didn't include really insects and bacteria.
Why is the range so large? Because, like, questioning one is considerable?
That is part of it, is questioning, but we also recognize that we don't know a lot of what's out there. Especially in the bottom of the ocean, we have no clue. But even in the ecosystems we think we do know well, so a couple years ago they found like a new species of a large mammal. I forget what it was. But it was something where it was like, how have we missed this thing that's like a meter tall? And we also generally know a lot about where historically Europeans have spread and explored, but we don't know as much about the other ecosystems because in part, we don't partner well with people in those environments to ask them for their knowledge. And we expect because we don't know about it that it doesn't exist. We've done a lot better with that in working with people living in other environments to partner with them to show us what they know. Another part of it is, what do we count as a species? Bacteria. There's a couple of you that are either in or have taken micro. Do we ever talk about a species with bacteria? A strain or a clade, maybe? Because in bacteria, we have no idea what defines them as a species and what doesn't. Because a lot of times what we use is their functionality to determine where they belong. And, well, considering they can do binary fission, and we're not even sure all of them sexually reproduce, species is a weird term. We also have no idea how many small insects there are, let alone how many nematodes there are. Does anyone have a number from Dr. DeBay? Has he told you how many nematode species there are? I have no idea, so you could throw out a number and I'd be like, that sounds good. I remember my zoology professor talking about just how many parasites there are, and he thought that our zoology textbook with like the 2 to 5 million types of insect or types of animals, and he was like, yeah, it could be that many parasites. And I remember being surprised. And then, do we count viruses as alive? We definitely don't determine them by species, but are they alive? The question is, do they meet the requirement of being able to reproduce on their own? And they require a host, so maybe not. But we consider parasites to be alive, and they require a host too, so it gets messy. we expect that there's about 2 million animals, really, mainly insects, that have vital roles without which life on Earth could not be possible. Things like our pollinators and species like that, where if we lose them, we're going to lose the capacity for life as we know it. Are you familiar with this concept? I think we've actually looked at this figure before, the food web, and that we have the grazing food web versus the detrital food web. Oh, look, I get to do this twice in one day. So natural selection. This is going to relate to species extinctions and species endangerment pretty well, because we expect that species are basically formed and that species are kept in check by things like natural selection, process by which organisms with some sort of an advantage reproduce more than others of their kind. That advantage is determined by whatever the selective agent is. Give me some examples of what we mean by selective agent.
Like a mutation for like skin or like fur color.
Nope, that's going to be things that are heritable. So mutations cannot be selective agents. Mutations are things that will be inherited, though, and that will increase variation. So mutations are going to play a huge role in natural selection.
Is it like the color of like their coat or
Why does that matter? Keep going with this.
like if you have like a white mouse or like a brown mouse and it's in the woods, like the white would be easier to see, so they'd be preyed on more than the brown.
So your predator is a selective agent.
That's what I was gonna say.
So your predator can be one of your selective agents.
There's the environment.
The environment is usually your other selective agent. So it's going to choose what traits are best. The predator is a selective agent because it eats some of them or kills them. And if they are gone, they cannot reproduce. They cannot pass their traits on. Now, a mutation may make something better at avoiding the selective agent. In the environment, it could be, can they find food? Can they find a place to live? Hawks or vultures. What if they were born with shorter wings? How do you think that would affect their lifestyle? How do hawks move from place to place?
The soar on the thermals.
The thermals. So the warm air as it rises, they hop from one to another. If they have shorter wings, do you think they'll be able to glide as well and stay aloft easily? No. So the selective agent there is going to be the environment. They won't be able to move properly in the environment. What it is selecting on is whatever their genes make them. So our essential components of natural selection are that there is some sort of inheritable variation. So your traits. So you get genetics passed from parent to child. Your next one is your population produces more offspring than the environment supports. How many mice does a mouse give birth to at one point in time in one litter? Toss out some numbers you think are reasonable.
6.
More.
15.
Yeah, possibly. Somewhere in like the 10 to 15, 8 to 15 range. Now imagine every mouse that was ever born on campus, or for that matter, every squirrel ever born on campus survived. Would our campus quickly be overrun by mice and squirrels? How many squirrels are in an average litter? 3 to 4 frequently? Are they all going to make it? What could be a selective agent for the squirrels on campus?
Food availability.
Food availability is one. habitat? Can they find a place to make a nest? Can they find a place to live? Can they find shelter? What's another one that involves us? Can they run faster than our cars? Are they smart enough to dodge car tires? Because only certain members of that population can survive and reproduce. It's not just about survival, it's survive and reproduce. And natural selection results in a population that is better adapted to its local environment. What benefits a squirrel living in a highly urbanized area might be different than what benefits a squirrel living out in a non-urbanized area. Oh, it's just related. Natural selection is related to evolution, which deals with changes in the population over time due to the accumulation of inherited differences. It can be subdivided into micro and macroevolution. Microevolution dealing with allele frequency changes, and macroevolution resulting in the creation of new species. Which brings us to speciation. The splitting of one species into two or more, or one species becoming another one over time. And there are two main types of speciation. I feel like I'm making most of you remember things you learned a really long time ago. Allopatric and sympatric. What is the difference? One requires something that the other does not. Allopatric requires it, but sympatric does not. Any guesses? Geographic barrier. So in allopatric, you have a geographic barrier of some sort. In sympatric, there's no barrier. Sympatric is much more common in plants. And what counts as a barrier? A mountain range, an ocean, sometimes a highway. Maybe not for deer, perhaps for caterpillars. You might wonder why all of this matters. Well, this is because, believe it or not, extinction is basically required for evolution to happen. Some species will need to go extinct so that there are empty areas for new species to evolve to take over. So there is this natural interplay between extinction and evolution. And we see that the rate of evolution sometimes changes in the fossil record. We tend to think of it as being fairly gradual, but after a mass extinction event, we usually find that the pace of speciation becomes very fast, or at least appears to from the fossil record, because there's all of these empty positions to be had in the ecosystem, allowing species to really grow and spread rapidly. So, the Arctic fox and the gray fox. We believe they came from a single early population of a fox. And that as they spread into different populations, into different regions, and as they interbred with those in the different regions, they changed. Certain traits made Arctic foxes survive where they were, and others made a gray fox survive where they were. Why might living in Pennsylvania be difficult for an Arctic fox?
It doesn't snow year-round.
Doesn't snow year-round. And Arctic foxes may still change color, but in the winter they are bright white. That's going to make them a target for hunters. But how easy is it going to see if the woods have no snow that a bright white predator is coming down on you if you're a small mammal? You're going to be able to run from that. How come the gray fox isn't going to make it in the northern areas?
It's going to stand out in the snow.
Stands out in the snow.
It will be cold.
It's going to freeze to death. So it's not just their colors that changed. Their fur, the size of their ears. Why do you want short ears if you live in the Arctic?
Because the amount of area that it's subject to.
Have you guys studied anything about human population in any of your classes? What do you know about the physical characteristics of people of Inuit or Eskimo descent versus those of sub-Saharan African descent? So those of Eskimo or Inuit descent, in general, are shorter, rounder, shorter legs, shorter arms, smaller ears, smaller nose. Those of sub-Saharan African descent are taller, longer limbs, much longer legs and arms usually, and larger features. Why is it important to be small and compact with smaller features in an area that's very cold? Absolutely. And in an area that is predominantly warm, you don't want that at all, do you? You want to be able to give off as much heat as possible. So we see that the physiology and the anatomy of their bodies is changing slightly. Foxes, separate species, but are humans separate species? Why no?
All humans have the ability to reproduce viable offspring.
We all reproduce viable offspring, and we really can pick anybody from any ethnic descent. Sarah, you were going to say?
I was just going to ask if it had to do with, like, geographically, the Arctic fox and the fox that can't swap.
That's another one, is that they generally are not found in the same places. Can we find places in human communities where you have a lot of different ethnicities? Absolutely. And we have a lot of migration and a lot of immigration and emigration, whereas we don't see the same necessarily in animal populations. Those where they do have a lot of mixing are usually a subspecies as opposed to a species. But with humans, we don't see that simply because of the constant mixing of human groups. Additionally, those of you who've had evolution and creation probably know this. This doesn't work as well with our class right now as it does with when I usually teach Bio 105. But on average, two white people have a similar amount of genetic differences, if not more, between them than do two people of different races. So race is skin color really is a very small portion of our genetic difference. There's a lot of other things that play in. It's just one that's very obvious to us. Are you familiar with this concept? All right, I want to hear, how did Dr. Dubé and Dr. Unander pronounce this word differently? And we'll see which one I prefer. Do you get niche from them, or niche, or have you learned this word before?
I've heard niche.
Niche?
Niche. What's her niche?
French pronunciation is niche. Both, I have heard both from my professors over the years. This niche or niche deals with what a species does in its ecosystem, but it also encompasses its habitat and its interactions with other species. So those are the three things that define the niche. There's two main categories we divide them in: a generalist and a specialist. A generalist has really broad conditions that it lives in, whereas a specialist has very specific conditions. The deer versus the panda bear, which is the generalist?
Deer.
Why?
Because if feeds on a variety of things and can survive in a variety of habitats.
Why is the panda bear a specialist? It lives in one habitat and it eats one thing, bamboo. Which one of these is most likely to survive? And which one of them is more likely to go extinct? How do you think the white-tailed deer is going to go extinct anytime soon? How do you think the panda bear could possibly go extinct sometime soon? How do you think that's unlikely, though, because people love pandas? Also, anybody really upset that I just called it a panda bear? Because it's not, in fact, a bear, right? What if this wasn't a panda up here? What if it was a beetle? Would your answer change? What if it was a specialist beetle? Do we care about beetles? Who does care about beetles but is not in this class? Tom. He'll be so upset. If you don't know, Tom, he loves insects. They're his favoriteest thing, like, in the whole wide world. Especially like wasps and things that can sting you, which I really don't get. So why is a specialist more likely to go extinct? It's self-explanatory, but I want to hear it from you guys.
Because if the panda that loses bamboo, and that's it, he's not gonna get anything else. Or if the deer loses some, like, say it's favorite trees, that's fine, just eat the grass.
So the generalist has this ability to adapt, whereas a specialist cannot. Are these words you're familiar with? What's a native species?
Like originated.
So it's evolved to live in that ecosystem. A non-native or an alien is something that has migrated to the ecosystem recently. What is the difference then between introduced and invasive?
Invasive is when it doesn't have any natural predators, so it takes over really quickly.
So it's well adapted to live there and it starts to take over really quickly. Whereas an introduced one, it's not going to take over everything. It may take over a small portion, but it's not going to take over. What's an indicator species? What does it make you think about?
It's like a species that provides some like verification of the quality of an ecosystem.
These are the ones that are really sensitive to change. So you're thinking caddisfly, mayfly larvae, right?
Yeah.
They tell you whether or not the water is really clean and really healthy and whether or not it will be good for the fish. Absolutely. So these indicator species, these are the ones that we use to determine what type of ecosystem is it and how healthy is it. So do the rest of you know, are caddisflies and mayflies, are they healthy water or are they polluted water? A water penny is polluted water usually. Caddisflies are pretty healthy. Mayflies even more so, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
So if water is heavily polluted, you're not going to find a lot of caddisflies or mayflies. It's a really easy way to do a quick check. We're going to do wetland delineation, God willing, next Monday. The indicator species for that are plants. Certain plants are indicators of what is a wetland and what is not. And what's a keystone species?
Species that's very important to its ecosystem.
So it's really important to the ecosystem and it somehow supports the function of the ecosystem. What's this? American alligator. It's a keystone species in marshes in southeastern United States. So it plays a big role in these wetlands. It was hunted almost to extinction, but it's come back. So yes, it is going to be a predator of a lot of other things, but we've also found that kind of like the gator holes that it makes, other organisms will come and live in those. So it creates habitat for other things living in a marsh. And when we realized that alligators were important is when they were being hunted. They discovered that not only were we losing alligators, but lots of other species living in the same wetlands were declining rapidly. So we didn't know that alligators somehow played a role in species richness and diversity in an ecosystem until we started killing them off. But I have really good news for you. The American alligator was removed from the endangered species list in 1987. Its population is doing remarkably well. In part, sometimes because people think it's cool to be able to go out in nature and go on a gator cruise. I think these are words you're all familiar with, so these are going to be really quick. Interspecific competition deals with when different species are competing against each other for a resource. Predation is when one species kills and eats another. Parasitism is when one species feeds on another, so the one is harmed and the one gets a benefit. In a mutualism, both are benefiting. And in commensalism, one species benefits and the other we don't think is harmed or benefits. The top picture, we have a bear eating a salmon. What does that represent? Predation. In the bottom picture, we have a baby cuckoo bird rolling an egg out of somebody else's nest. What does that represent? Parasitism. Those of you who are in ornithology know this. Cuckoo birds, along with cowbirds, are nest parasites. They're brood parasites. They don't take care of their own offspring. They lay their eggs in other animals' nests so that other animals are forced to raise and care for their offspring. The baby cuckoo birds, actually, when they hatch, one of the first things they do is kick out one of the other eggs. Genetically, they're predisposed to this. And in cowbirds, we know that they will come back to check on their offspring, and if the other birds aren't doing a good job raising it, they'll kill one of the other birds' offspring. So not all birds are nice, and some birds are really like the opposite of good parents. They abandon their children and just come back and go, you kept my baby alive, yours can live. So they're very bad. What about our anemone and our anemone fish? Mutualism. How many of you learned in high school that was commensalism? Any of you learned in high school that it was mutualism? For the longest time, we thought this was the perfect example of commensalism. The clownfish, anemone fish doesn't get eaten, but the anemone gets nothing. We've now found that that is not true. Most cases of commensalism now appear to either be slight parasitism or slight mutualisms. We've discovered what the anemone gets is the scraps of food that the anemone fish doesn't eat as it's eating. Additionally, it may get fertilized through the anemone fish waste production. So it does get something. What we still don't know in this relationship is whether or not the anemone fish creates its own mucus covering that makes it immune to the anemone stings, or if the anemone creates it for the anemone fish. We're not sure how it works. They're one of the only fish that have a mucus covering that makes them immune to being stung by the anemones. This is demonstrating a concept known as resource partitioning. We have 5 different types of warblers that can all live in the same tree, but they all live in different portions of the same tree. This allows them to use the same resource, but only to use part of it. It allows for higher diversity in an ecosystem. Anyone know what type of plant this is? And if you don't know the species, what kind of plant is the red flowering thing? It's an epiphyte. It's a bromelid. An epiphyte is also known as an air plant. These do not root in the ground. As a matter of fact, their roots don't even have to be attached to anything at all. If you aren't really good at taking care of plants but want to have some in your room, epiphytes are kind of the way to go. The air plants, you don't need a pot, you don't need anything. They can just grow on their own. They do need some water sometimes and low levels of nutrients. But we find that in tropical rainforests, this is probably our best example in the world of commensalism. The tree itself is not at all hurt by the epiphyte. The epiphyte doesn't even take any nutrients from it. But without the tree, the epiphyte would not be able to grow. I've already mentioned the fact that extinction is a natural process and that we're currently at about 1,000 times the background rate because of humans. Some expectations say that up to 50% of the species will be gone by 2100. If that happens, we will be in a mass extinction crisis because at a certain point, the ecosystems do start to fall apart. Unfortunately, our most biodiverse areas on the planet seem to be at the highest risk for extinction right now. And if you read the articles, you realize that all mass extinctions in the past had natural influences, usually some great climatic incident or asteroid. I probably shouldn't have had all these words pop up. What makes a species likely to be endangered or threatened? A small population. That makes sense, right? If there's fewer of you, it's a better chance you're going to go extinct. A specialist. That one's easy. How might migration routes make a species likely to become endangered?
If they're compromised by urbanization or human things.
So if they require like a singular migration route and we subdivide it up or otherwise impact it, absolutely increases their likelihood of becoming endangered or threatened or even going extinct, because if they can't move through their whole migration area, they can't get to where they need to be. How about needing large territories? That makes sense? Because we fragment habitat all the time. Having a low reproductive rate, that also makes sense. If you have 1 or 2 offspring over the course of your lifetime, you're much more likely to go extinct than the mouse is having like 10, 15 at a time. Habitat loss, obvious. Disease, obvious. A high price, usually because it's something that we want a lot of or a high demand. And then HIPCO. Anyone remember what that stands for from the book? So habitat destruction, invasive species, population growth, pollution, climate change, and overexploitation. Because we are usually finding that no species is endangered or threatened for one reason. There's a combination of factors, and that HIPCO encompasses all of the major ones that put a species at risk of extinction today. These are 4 endangered species. What is A?
Florida panther.
Yep. What's B? Yep. C? Nope. Hawksbill sea turtle. How about D? Whooping crane. These are really different types of species, aren't they? We got a plant. And we don't tend to think about plants as being endangered. We automatically assume animals. And we usually assume mammals, maybe birds.
Is it because everyone tries to buy these plant traps?
There is some demand, but really it's because of where they're found. They tend to be found in wetlands, which tend to be threatened. It's kind of weird. All of your carnivorous plants thrive in nitrogen poor wetlands because they get all of the nitrogen they need from the insects and other things that they eat. as much as I'm not sure the word eat is right for a plant. Consume, can we go with that? So they live in nitrogen poor wetlands, which are areas that we don't tend to protect. And they thrive where nothing else can. So they are very extreme habitat specialists. Sea turtles. They have a really weird risk. It's related to climate change. At warm temperatures, sea turtle eggs tend to move towards which gender? Elizabeth, do you remember which one?
The warmer ones are the males and the colder ones are the females.
I think is it flipped? I think warmer's female.
Really?
I think crocodile's the other way.
Okay, yeah.
For your crocodiles and your turtles and some of the other things, the temperature at which the eggs develop is problematic. What happens as the climate changes? We get warmer, which shifts the gender dynamics, which is suddenly all of your clutches are being born one gender or the other. What does that mean? The population's going to decrease dramatically, really quickly. How about the crane and the panther? Habitat loss? Hunting for the panther, perhaps? Not necessarily because we want to eat it, but because we believe it is a pest to our environments and our things. Habitat loss is the biggest cause, hands down, species endangerment. In the US, 85% of our about 2,000 threatened and endangered species are threatened and endangered because of habitat loss. It may be habitat loss with something else, but habitat loss plays a dramatic role. That can be destruction, it can be degradation or fragmentation. Because we use the land temporarily, we may completely destroy their area or make it uninhabitable for them. Florida Everglades are kind of a great example of this. And they're part of the reason why the Florida panther is endangered. We fragmented it. We changed the flow of the rivers that feed the Everglades. We made areas into farmland and housing development and golf courses as opposed to wetlands. And then we don't want the panther living on our golf courses and our housing developments, do we? Let alone on our citrus farms. Land and aquatic species can face habitat loss differently. In aquatic systems, it may not be habitat loss like we think of, but it may be because the coral reef is damaged, or it may be because of pollution or sedimentation issues that they're dealing with habitat loss. Coral reefs and tropical rainforests are where we tend to focus because these are biodiversity hotspots. Lots of things live there that are found no place else. The expectation is that about 60% of coral reefs worldwide at this moment are on the verge of destruction. I've seen numbers, and I hate the numbers, that say that most coral reefs will be gone in the next 50 years. Your textbook, I think, says 40 years. 70% of bird species are declining. 12% are threatened with extinction. Almost all of those birds are migratory or live in tropical areas or in forests. 60 to 80% of the land surface and 50% of aquatic ecosystems are impacted by human activities. What do we do when we lose the birds? They control our pests, they pollinate things for us, they disperse seeds everywhere. They're a problem. They're not the indicator species we looked to for ecosystem health. Does anyone know what type of animals we look to as our indicator species for overall ecosystem health? Amphibians. Amphibians are the big one. When you see the amphibians going extinct or getting sick, it means the ecosystem is really, really unhealthy. They're usually the first ones to go. You saw this picture before, way back in chapter 1. This is what happens after clear cutting of a forest in Thailand. This was a tropical rainforest. you can see that the soil surface is dry and cracked. Why does clear cutting of a tropical rainforest result in this? Because rainforests are wet, so the ground should not be dry, right? But why are rainforests wet? The canopy traps all the moisture, and it keeps it continuously filtering back through the system. Without that tree canopy, we have high rates of evapotranspiration. This is satellite images where the red, these are infrared satellite images. That red is actually showing you high densities of trees. This was the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso. That picture is 1992. This picture is 2006. That's 14 years of deforestation. How many of you were hoping that this was like 50 years? And what do you think we were clear cutting for? Sarah, what do you think we were clear cutting for? What don't you like that we do in Brazil?
Hmm?
You really don't like it.
No.
Cattle farming.
Yeah.
Cattle ranching was the main cause, and crop growing for cattle ranching. Also some building of human areas, but mainly cattle ranching. This is the African elephant, the black rhino, the Indian tiger, and the Asian or Indian elephant, depending upon your interpretation. Probable ranges versus current ranges. They're dramatically different. This is why their populations are a lot smaller. They just can't survive in this small of an area. Invasive species are our second reason for endangerment. It's worth pointing out that a lot of things that we've moved from place to place have been beneficial. Just a few of them have been really, really bad. Really bad. Most of them are moved for one reason or another. Sometimes it's deliberate. Sometimes it's accidental. One of the deliberate ones is kudzu, which is that top picture. We brought kudzu over from Asia to southeastern United States to control soil erosion. It works really well. It also grows really fast. I have heard rates of growth, and I don't know how well that this works in nature, but in the lab of up to 6 inches in a day. Even if it's only an inch a day, how do you control that? The next one is the lionfish. Accidental. Maybe deliberate. There's a couple different stories. One story is that a pet shop was closing. Nobody wanted to buy the lionfish, so they dumped them out into the, around the coast of Florida near the Keys. Lionfish today have taken over. Every year, they have a lionfish cook-off. They're trying to create a lionfish demand in Florida cuisine so that the lionfish can be caught and fished. But as you know, lionfish are poisonous. So it's really difficult to convince people to eat a poisonous fish, other than puffer. I'm not sure why people are okay with eating puffer fish. Lionfish isn't going to kill you if it's not alive. The poisonous spines are removed before you eat it. Pythons were released in the Everglades because people didn't want them as pets anymore. Rats were taken by plane to Hawaii by mistake. They got out and they ate the birds. Then we introduced mongoose because you all learned at some point in time, probably from the cartoon movie Rikki Tikki Tavi, if you all watched that mongoose eat rats. But mongoose are active at night and rats are active during the day. So mongoose don't eat rats.
I thought that was snakes. Don't mongoose eat snakes?
They do, but they are also supposed to eat rats. And islands are a big problem. In Guam, we released, by mistake, the brown tree snake from planes, U.S. military planes, and that's why Guam has almost no birds. That's our mongoose eating a bird. Okay, so we've been talking about hip coat. Does anyone remember what H was? number one reason animals are at risk of being extinct or endangered?
Habitat loss.
Habitat loss. How about the eye?
Invasive.
Invasive species. And our examples for that were the kudzu vine in the United States, the rats, and then the mongoose in Hawaii, the brown tree snake in Guam, the lionfish in Florida. The P, first P, stands for population growth. The second P is pollution, and the C is climate change. These are things that we've already talked about quite a bit. You know that the more our population grows, the more land you need, the more resources you need, the more food you need, the more consumption there is. Coastal ecosystems, like within 200 miles of a coast, have a really difficult time because that's where about more than half of the world's population lives. So those areas become dramatically stressed very quickly. Lots of people, small concentration. We find that areas around water are highly stressed because this is where people are. Pollution, though, is a big problem too. Why do we pollute things?
To deal with waste.
Part of it is dealing with our waste. Why else do we pollute things? Or what are ways through which we pollute things?
Energy production.
Energy production. Agriculture. Someone asked me recently what was my opinion on them putting fertilizers and herbicides all over their lawn to ensure that it was nice and pretty and green. I just kind of shook my head as my response, and I was like, is it necessary? Well, I don't want any weeds to mess up my grass. That's okay, isn't it? And my response was on the concept that weeds make an ecosystem. All grass is a monotype structure, perhaps not a healthy ecosystem. Pesticides. We think kill close to 65 to 70 million birds a year. We don't know how many millions of fish die per year due to pesticide exposure because we simply think that we can't really track it. And we have no idea how many possibly die in the ocean. With birds, our estimates come from what we find either dead on beaches that have washed up or that die on land. Pollution can kill things outright, or it can weaken their immune systems, or decrease their ability to digest food, or any other way that stresses the body out. But we see when pollution doesn't kill, it's usually the disease that follows up the pollution that does. 20% of U.S. endangered and threatened species are at risk of extinction because of pesticide poisoning. That's not even all pollution, that's just pesticides. That doesn't count the number of birds and other animals that are at risk due to lead poisoning from lead shot. Do you use lead shot?
It's banned for waterfowl hunting. It's
Exactly.
only steel now. In some states they banned it completely, but for like upland game, you can use it. You can use lead shot. Yeah.
So in some places you can. The reason we can't use it in wetlands is really simple.
Yeah.
The lead gets in the water and it either resembles food for things or it starts to give off lead into the water.
Yeah.
We know heavy metal poisoning is bad. Honeybees. You've heard about this idea, I imagine by now, the colony collapse disorder. What do we believe it's related to? Pesticides. For a long time, it was thought that it was potentially a fungal or a viral disease, but we now believe that it's linked to pesticides. Either that or that the bees become susceptible because of pesticide use. We could talk about oil pollution, but that's
I
it.
recently heard of something with cell phone radiation, like
With bees?
the wavelengths that like cell phone towers give off.
Does it disrupt their
Yeah, like,
Their flight
it interrupts, like,
movements?
their flight because they fly by using the matching the gigahertz of like the gravitational
That's
force
right,
or whatever. because they're like physically, like it's impossible that they can fly.
Which is crazy because you
Yeah.
wouldn't think that things, well, and if it's cell phone towers, could it also be our Wi-Fi signals and other things that could affect their physiology?
Yeah, I recently heard it was something like that. They just like can't fly, so they can't move and they die.
How long do we live without honeybees? Not long. Should we all assume not long? Did I mention in here the company that I thought was really interesting when they started supporting honeybee research years and years and years ago? It was Ben and Jerry's. That sounds kind of strange, right? Vanilla is pollinated by bees. And my understanding is almost entirely by bees. And they recognize, on one hand, that it's good to be good to the environment, but that it is also important to have vanilla for making their ice cream. And without vanilla, they wouldn't be able to make a lot of their ice creams. Because, well, truthfully, given a choice of something that contains vanilla, how many of you are going to choose real vanilla versus artificial vanilla? Almost everybody. And if you're paying that much money for ice cream, you want it to be real. So they started getting involved a little bit in that. And this was happening, oh gosh, it was well over 10 years ago. They had started doing some work to help honeybee populations and educating people then about honeybee populations. When it was just starting to come up, you had these food companies jumping on going, this is important. Climate change, we talk about that one a lot. It's temperatures, it's drought, it's rainfall, it's extreme weather events, ocean acidification, ice melting. And then the causes of climate change too, the pollution and the deforestation, the ranching of cattle as opposed to the growing of trees. Those are all going to affect populations. Oh, I don't want to look at the next picture. Polar bear is eating a seal. There's as of 2016, there were 19 populations of polar bears left, with a total of 20 to 25,000 polar bears left in the wild. Without sea ice, we don't know how polar bears will survive. So it's a habitat loss issue, but it's a climate change issue. That's what they hunt from. That O in HIPCO is overexploitation. The killing, capturing, selling of wild species at a rate that's higher than they can replace themselves. Could be overhunting for food. Are there animals you can think of that we overhunt for food, though? We did the passenger pigeon, perhaps. Maybe not. The dodo, okay. Steller's sea cow, which was a manatee in East Indies. Yes, we hunted it. Tasha, what's your paper topic?
Whaling.
Would you say that we are overhunting or perhaps overfishing our whales? Some species. But most of the things that we think of as hunting for food, are we hunting them at too high of a rate? White-tailed deer? Absolutely not. We probably should be hunting them more. Pheasants, turkeys? Probably they're fine. Can you think of any animals that are sold for their body parts, that are hunted for their, not necessarily for meat, but for body parts? Sharks. You're thinking of shark finning? How many of you are familiar with the process of shark finning? It's disgusting. Shark fins are considered a delicacy. So they catch the sharks, they pull them up, they cut the fins off, and they throw them back. What do you think happens to a shark without its fins? And sometimes they'll take the pectorals as well, not just the top. What do you think happens? Well, it can't swim. What happens if a shark can't swim? For the most part, except for a couple species, it can't breathe. Also, they're bleeding to death. They have these large gaping wounds. But shark fin is a delicacy. Shark steaks, not so much. This isn't necessarily a problem here as much as it is in Asia. It's illegal in a lot of open waters of different countries for it to happen, but it's still legal in portions of the Pacific Ocean. In the United States waters, shark finning is completely illegal. It is seen as inhumane because you are leaving something to die. What's some land animals that we hunt for parts? Elephants?
Black bears.
Black bears?
Yeah.
Rhinos? So either as trophies or for their tusks, or what do we use rhino horn for? What?
Is it ivory?
Nope, that's elephants. Rhino horn is made of keratin, similar more to hair and nails than it is to anything else.
Souvenirs?
Mhm.
Souvenirs?
Mm-mm.
So using like Eastern medicine?
Chinese medicine. It doesn't work. It's also not apparently an aphrodisiac. It's used for a couple different things, that it's sold as things that it actually doesn't work for. With some of the rhinos and the elephants that are at the large preserves, they actually remove their tusks and the horns in order to save the animals from potential poaching efforts. For the sale of pets caught in the wild, about 1 out of 50 makes it to the market. Some of them it's a little better. I think about 80% of tropical birds might make it. There are 60 species of tropical birds that are endangered that are sold on the illegal pet trade on a regular basis. Tigers. We actually use tiger bones in Chinese medicine as well, and their hides are taken for rugs. If tigers are continuously hunted and there aren't more protections for them, there's the potential that they could be gone by 2030 or 2040 from the wild. Thankfully, the governments where tigers are found are working hard to protect them for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the money they can make through ecotourism. Overfishing it really started with whales, and we really started overfishing because of blubber being used as a source of fuel for oil lamps. That's when we started killing a lot of fish at a rapid, well, whales aren't fish, they're mammals, but killing things from the ocean at a rapid rate. Commercial fishing fleets have made this worse, and more than 70% of the world's fisheries are either significantly exploited, overexploited, or fully exploited, meaning we can't get more fish than the number we're getting right now for the remainder of eternity until we let the population recover. Overfishing, even more so than ocean acidification and coral reef damage, is seen as the biggest problem in the ocean today. Because when you overfish, you stand a decent chance of collapsing the entire ecosystem. And cyanide and dynamite are used in fish collection, especially from reefs, for tropical fish, for fish tanks. This sounds bad, right? You don't use enough cyanide to kill them, but you carry around the cyanide tablets, you drop in a couple drops, and then when the fish are all kind of stunned because they're knocked out, you gather them up and you take them with you, and that's how you collected your fish. They were really easy to catch then. Because how many of you have ever tried to actually grab a fish in a barrel? imagine now you're not just grabbing a fish in a barrel where it's contained, but you're grabbing a fish from the ocean. It's going to get away from you. So you use the cyanide tablets to make sure it doesn't. Other than Elizabeth, Cody, or Tasha, how do you think dynamite fishing works? Just like it sounds. You light your stick of dynamite, you blow things up, and why do you think dynamite fishing is helpful for catching fish? They stun them and they all float up to the surface and you can gather what ones are left alive. If you decide someday that you want to have a tropical fish tank, especially a saltwater fish tank, figure out where the fish that you're buying in the pet store come from. Very few fish that are available for commercial saltwater trade are grown in captivity. Most of them are caught wild. And for that number of about 1 out of 50 is probably close to true. At best, it's about 1 out of 20 that makes it into somebody's tank alive. And then a strange one to think about for overexploitation are things like orchids and cacti, or other decorative plants that people take from the wild and bring home with them. You do destruction to perhaps what else is left there, but you're taking something out of the ecosystem. Have you all at some point in time visited a national park or national seashore, national forest, something like that? And you see the signs at almost all of them that say that the only thing you're supposed to take with you are memories and photographs. But we see something and we want to take it. Maybe you don't. Maybe I don't. But maybe we need to figure out how to get everybody else there too. The precautionary principle is not a biological principle necessarily. This might come more from economics and business than anything else, but we can apply it to literally everything we've talked about this semester. But perhaps it makes the most sense to talk about it here. This is the idea that when the evidence for a problem indicates that there's been some type of harm, or that there could be some type of harm, you should take measures in order to reduce or prevent the harm. So if we know that hunting tigers could drive them to extinction, we should stop that. This is the principle that they're using in a number of European countries now in whether or not things should be allowed out that are new chemicals. If we think it might cause harm, we should not use it until we know whether or not it does. The problem is, you've all studied ecosystems to some extent, or if not, you've studied cells or other parts of biology. Do we always understand the cause and effect? Sometimes we think this is the cause and we think this is the effect, but there's no direct relationship. Or we're not sure which of these 10 causes it is, but we're positive it's one of them. Or this one cause could have 5 different effects. And because of that, it makes it really hard for people that are not scientists to make decisions with this. Because they're like, how do you not understand? They're used to businesses where things are a little bit more cut and dry, or a little more obvious. If we run out of money, we will go bankrupt. That one's easy. But it's not that easy for us. Our question with this has been, should we start protecting the habitats of species that could become threatened before they become threatened? Should we put our focus there? Or should we put our focus on those that are already in trouble? Should we include those that we don't think we have a chance of saving? Or just focus on those where we think we have the best chance to save them? Which species gets the most attention? And how do we convince other people to spend money on it? An example of that would be anytime there's a research project funded on butterflies and it gets out into the news, people get really angry. I don't eat butterflies. They're not big pollinators. Why are we spending money on tracking butterfly populations? There are a couple other things that I don't understand. Why is that important? We should be spending money on things that matter, like protecting polar bears. But which one do you think is probably easier to protect, butterflies or polar bears? Butterflies, maybe? Because we can't stop climate change perhaps as easily as we can habitat destruction where a butterfly lives. But what do you think? Do we focus on saving things that are in really bad shape? Or in things that are only in medium bad shape? Or on animals that aren't even yet in bad shape but could be in the future? And heaven forbid that we make this about plants too. What do we do? What do you think? How many of you would say, I want to save the things that we have the best chance at saving first so we can prove that things work? Think that might be a way to do it? Or do you want to save the things that are in the worst condition because they're the ones in the worst condition, so we should focus on them first? Because if this was a hospital, you save the person that's in the worst condition that you can save first, and then you work to ones that are in better condition through triage. Are you hoping I'm going to give you an answer to this? Because I don't have one. I do know that funding agencies and the public like to have success stories. When you apply for grants, for research grants, they usually want you to be able to demonstrate that you've had one before. It's the same way that you apply for jobs. They want you to demonstrate you've had one before and you did a good job with the money somebody gave you. Just like when you go to get a job, they want to know where you've worked before and will your boss give you a good recommendation. What are some animals we have saved?
North American bison.
Bison. California condor. American alligator. We're in process, we think, of saving cranes, sandhill cranes. Yeah, whooping cranes. Bald eagle. These are all success stories. They're all mostly large animals. And they're mostly the phrase is charismatic megafauna. Large things that we can get people to care about. They're cute or a little creepy, but I don't know how we get people to save the alligators, but we did. Maybe because you all grew up with cartoons where there were like funny or cute alligators in them. I think we all did, and it works. This is a difficult question. How do we make the best decision? But I think the best decision is sometimes going to be to focus on the things that are already in trouble, because if you start saving them, you have the potential to save everything else that lives with them. What drives, when we talk about restoration, one of the things that drives restoration work, where we're taking a damaged ecosystem and making it better, is this concept that you don't restore a single species. You restore the ecosystem that the species is part of. Because if you do that, you are saving more than one thing at once. And that's usually where we get sometimes the precautionary principle, is the idea that to save a species, we have to save its ecosystem, which in turn makes this a lot easier to sell, because I'm not saving one animal, I'm saving an entire ecosystem. So how do we do this? You protect the habitat. We do this. believe it or not, we've been a leader in habitat protection worldwide. The policies that we use to protect habitat, other countries look at and they send their representatives here to learn from us of how do you protect habitat. Even though worldwide only 13% of habitat is protected, and even then only 5% of habitat is protected from human use. How do we do it? Well, wildlife refuges, nature preserves, everything that falls under that umbrella. There are 548 wildlife refuges in the United States. It's a ton. There are a number of them within driving distance of here. Some of them focus on one species. Do you know what Hines focuses on? John Hines Refuge? Birds, mainly. But no, it's not. And they're not a single species reserve. They focus on mainly waterfowl, but then they have forested areas with birds. They have game birds. They have turkeys. They have reptiles and turtles that they protect. And some of the amphibians that live there are actually in threatened to endangered status. They have a couple invasive things like some swans to deal with, but it's a very successful reserve. And they've managed to keep it successful even though it is directly next to an airport. We think that we need to protect at least 20% of the Earth's habitats in order to protect animals better and plants better. But this whole thing is super controversial. Who is familiar with the northern spotted owl controversy? So what was the problem?
We were logging like old growth forests, and these owls nested in the tops of these really old mature trees, and their populations were dwindling. So we protected them, and then we moved on, like logged a different area, but like their populations never rebounded, even though they were protected. So it was like, if we protect them but they didn't rebound, why were we protecting them in the first place?
Yeah, this was in the 1980s, maybe, that this was a big problem. I remember because the spotted owl controversy is the first environmental problem I remember reading about ever. I was in elementary school. And do you remember in elementary school? I don't know if they had the same thing for you guys that they did for me. There were like the little weekly readers that had like newspaper articles that were dumbed down for elementary kids. Some of you might have had them. It went on for multiple weeks, the spotted owls, and we were reading about it. And I remember thinking like, why do we have to cut down all the trees? Why can't we just save the owls? It seemed really simple to me. I was like in second grade going, I think we should save the owls. We should absolutely save owls. But the logging industry suggested that between 30 and 160,000 jobs would be lost if we stopped logging the forest where the spotted owls were, even though they were endangered. The U.S. Forest Service looked at it and they found a pretty similar estimate of jobs to be lost. They expected that wood harvest from the Pacific Northwest would decrease by 80%. Which was terrifying for the logging industry and the housing industry because where would our lumber come from? Loggers and sawmill owners were pitted against environmentalists. This was a big time of people chaining themselves to bulldozers and trees and all sorts of things. And I love how it just flooded the media with things because people got really clever about what they were doing. There were sales of bumper stickers all over the country that read, "Kill a spotted owl, save a logger," and "I like spotted owls fried," in support of the logging industry, clearly not in support of the owls. People would hang plastic owl sculptures all over the sawmills in order to like demonstrate what they wanted them to care about. And some of the sawmills would actually decorate themselves in that. So they would be able to point to it if somebody lost their job, you lost your job because of this. it was a media sensation because people are losing their jobs because of owls. This is really not okay. So we did protect the owl because we determined that the owl was actually an indicator species for the entire Pacific Northwest hardwood forests. We protected it. It was protected under the Endangered Species Act and the National Forest Management Act. It changed the way we logged the Northwest. And President Clinton determined the Northwest Forest Plan in 1994. Less logging was done. But they really changed the way the logging was done so that it wasn't a clear cutting, that it was a selective cutting. They also were able to develop a lot of jobs there in other types of work. So in the end, there was not actually a loss of jobs in the end. I think there was a net growth of jobs in the end, where it was about equal. But the owl's still threatened, and its population decreases between 5 and 7% a year. Anyone want to suggest why? We've protected its habitat. Because the barred owl is invasive in the Pacific Northwest, and it outcompetes the spotted owl for the same protected habitat. We saved the habitat. We may not be able to fully save the spotted owl, but we've saved everything else that lives there. So this is one of those partial success stories. In general, when we protect habitat, we can either focus on protecting single species or multi-species, or we focus on biodiversity hotspots, places where there's a large richness of species and a large richness of endemic species found no place else. This bird is the brown pelican. It was endangered even in 1903, when the Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge was established in Florida. The brown pelican was removed from the endangered species list in 2009. It is no longer endangered. It is not even threatened. Their populations are increasing, and in some areas now it's considered a pest because it is no problem walking up to you and stealing your fish. These are the 34 biodiversity hotspots that we would like to protect based on land biodiversity. This does not include coral reefs or anything aquatic. We have a couple strange ones on here. What's the one closest to us look like it's in the middle of? Smoky Mountains. Any guesses what we have a great diversity and richness of there? Salamanders, amphibians, some wildflowers. But much of the areas that we want to protect are in our less developed nations, which is going to make protecting them more difficult because you're going to have to balance people's needs against the environment's needs pretty strongly. We can prevent invasions. Literally, we can fix this one. Not all of it, but we can fix it pretty well. And we've discovered we cannot manage them once something gets established, not well, but we can prevent them. But we don't know what makes one species a good invader in one ecosystem and what makes it a bad invader in another ecosystem. We don't know what makes some species successful in invading everywhere and some incapable of invading anywhere. We don't. We also don't know what makes a habitat vulnerable. We know that habitats that have more direct influence by humans are more vulnerable, but we don't know why two ecosystems equally impacted by humans are not equally vulnerable to invasive species. We can't build projection models because there's not enough information. What we are doing is better inspecting animals and plants and crops and things that we bring from one place to another. Some of you are familiar with Spartina alterniflora. It's our normal wetland, salt marsh wetland plant on the East Coast. We took it to the West Coast intentionally because their salt marshes were dying rapidly. So we took alterniflora thinking that it would help. Spartina alterniflora doesn't really compete against anything very well here. It grows on that last little margin where it's constantly inundated by salt water. Let me tell you, in the California salt marshes, that plant is doing so well. It was one of the things where we finally woke up and realized, wait a minute, we really need to stop when we restore an ecosystem, taking one plant from someplace else and putting it someplace else. We need to actively cultivate native things to replant into an ecosystem. But our biggest invasion threat, I think, is ballast water. Do you know how ballast water works? So ships have these large tanks called ballast tanks on them. They take on water in one port, and it helps balance them out as they're traveling across the ocean. And when they get to the port where they're going to end, they let out their ballast waters. So we've picked up water from here, and we've taken water to here. So we've picked up all of the species here, and we've taken all of the species here. They've done ballast tank inspection, and they've found upwards sometimes of 300 to 500 different species, easily 300 different species represented. I think it was 367 in a study that was done from Japan to Oregon. Even if 1% of those species become established, that's 3.5 species every trip. And there are a lot of marine invaders that have come from ballast water transport. So we now treat it in multiple ways. One is we've installed UV light fixtures. At the trip to the wastewater treatment plant, we learned that UV light kills things, doesn't it? Works really well. One of the other ways that we do this is we have ships trade out their ballast water in the open ocean. That might seem strange to you, but what thrives on a coastline is going to be very different than what thrives in the open ocean. So you can easily trade things out that way and have a much lessened impact. So how do we stop the pollution, the population, the climate change? We talked about all this before with those chapters. We can reduce overexploitation. The best way to do it is education. And the best way to do that, to make money, is ecotourism. There are a lot of rich people willing to pay a whole lot of money to go take pictures of tigers. Or to go diving on a coral reef where they're one of a handful of people there. They'll pay whole lots of money to do those things. Let's let them. And let's use that money then to generate revenue to keep people employed, which will allow people in the community to develop jobs that have nothing to do with impacting the environment and everything to do with getting other people in to care about the environment there. This is working. We see ecotourism as a way that's actually changing the cultures and the environmental actions in small islands in the South Pacific. It's changing everything throughout Central America as well. And we're tracking animals. We're using technology. Here we have a leatherback sea turtle. There we have a toucan. We're putting trackers on them to see where they go so we know where to protect them. So you might wonder, how much money, though, is ecotourism worth? A lion hide sells, so the skin of a lion sells for $1,000. If a lion lives to the age of 7, it will generate, on average, $500,000 in ecotourism money. But part of that is to get the economy to recognize, and the people that are part of that economy to see that you have to wait for money as opposed to getting money immediately. We can preserve species. 3% of plants right now are preserved in a seed bank. Their seeds are preserved because we're realizing we need to preserve seeds so that if we have an area wiped out, we can repopulate it with seeds. About 1/3 of all plant species in the world have examples that are in botanical gardens or arboretums, many of them in breeding, plant breeding work in order to keep those plants healthy and to have communities that if we need to repopulate from, we can. Zoos, aquariums, wildlife parks, animal research centers are doing the same thing with animals, and captive breeding programs are saving countless species every single year. I don't want to talk about